The year was 1990, and Colorado's Arkansas River was restless, its surface cloaked in morning mist that drifted like whispers of a secret waiting to be told. On May 15th, the crisp bite of mountain spring carried an energy that seemed to electrify the air, filling each breath with the promise of adventure and the quiet edge of danger. For 8 members of the University of Denver's Outdoor Recreation Club, this 3-day rafting expedition through Browns Canyon wasn't just another trip. It was the reward for months of preparation, the kind of journey they believed would etch itself into memory and bind them together for life. At the river's edge stood Sarah Mitchell, a 21-year-old psychology major whose auburn hair always seemed to escape her ponytail, betraying her restless nature. She tugged at her life jacket again and again, nerves buzzing beneath her smile. Her best friend Jessica Wong, steady and calm as always, laughed as she teased, "That vest's not getting any tighter, Sarah." But the truth was, she understood the jitters. The river had a way of humbling even the most prepared. Their leader, Marcus Thompson, a senior majoring in outdoor recreation, commanded their attention as he stood beside the gleaming yellow raft. His voice carried confidence born of experience. He had guided countless trips before, but behind his eyes flickered a worry only someone who knew the river's moods could sense. The snowmelt had been heavier that spring, and the Arkansas was swollen, surging higher and faster than Marcus had seen in years. David Chen, the group's unofficial photographer and a journalism major, clutched his waterproof camera, eager to capture not just images, but a story that could leap off the page of the student newspaper. Nearby, twins Amy and Andrea Sullivan, who shared not only a bond but traditions dating back to childhood, braided each other's hair as if weaving strands of courage before the ride ahead. Elena Rodriguez, Marcus's girlfriend and a determined environmental science major, checked their supply bags, her foresight to pack for 5 days instead of 3, drawing good-natured teasing from the group. "Better safe than sorry," she had said, words that would later echo with haunting significance. At the raft's edge, Robert Bobby Kim, the quiet, analytical engineering student, carefully organized the rescue gear with the precision of someone who trusted logic more than luck. For centuries, the Arkansas River had carved its way through Colorado's rugged backbone, and Browns Canyon was celebrated as the ideal mix of thrill and safety, at least in ordinary seasons. But as Marcus scanned the roiling, chocolate-brown current, his gut clenched. Since the age of 14, these waters had been his proving ground. Yet that morning, something about their rhythm struck him as unpredictable, almost defiant. He called out, his voice firm. "The river's running 3 feet higher than normal. That means sharper rapids, harder pulls, and no room for mistakes. If anyone goes overboard, remember, feet up, body back, and never try to stand in moving." Water. The group listened with a solemnity that cut through their excitement, though the spark of youth's invincible optimism still shone in their eyes. Sarah reached for Jessica's hand, squeezing it in their quiet ritual of courage. David lifted his camera, capturing the moment. The 8 of them framed against Colorado's towering cliffs and endless wilderness, their faces bright with anticipation, unaware that this photograph would become a frozen echo of joy before the river demanded its toll. The raft pushed away from the sandy bank at Heckler Junction, surrendering itself instantly to the raw grip of the Arkansas River. The current seized them with almost human eagerness, dragging the boat into its restless rhythm of surge and release. Elena's knuckles whitened around her paddle as she stared at the churning surface, the hypnotic whirl of eddies and foam both mesmerizing and unnerving. Around them, the roar of rushing water drowned out all but Marcus's sharp commands, a reminder that the river was not a playground. It was a force older and far stronger than any of them. Their first rapid, ominously named pinball loomed ahead, its presence betrayed not by sound but by the subtle distortion of water over unseen rock. From the stern, Marcus's eyes tracked every ripple and shadow. "Forward paddle!" he barked, and 8 blades hit the water in unison. The raft lunged into the rapid like a living beast, spinning and crashing through waves that slapped cold spray into their faces. Shouts of exhilaration rose over the chaos, laughter mixing with adrenaline. For hours, it seemed as though preparation had paid off. Rapid after rapid fell behind them, each conquered with rhythm and teamwork. Elena's carefully packed supplies offered them brief reprieves, while Bobby's calculating mind suggested subtle shifts in their seating that made the raft more responsive. Amy and Andrea's twin voices blended seamlessly as they called out obstacles, their synchronicity adding a strange musical quality to the chaos. The landscape towered around them, rugged and eternal. Ponderosa pines clung defiantly to steep, canyon walls, granite cliffs loomed like ancient guardians, and above it all stretched an impossibly clear Colorado sky. David's camera clicked relentlessly, hoarding memories, sunlight on wet faces, arms raised in triumph, the fragile joy of friends too young to believe in endings. As afternoon painted the canyon in amber light, Marcus searched for a campsite. The plan had been to stop near Goodwin Rapids, but swollen waters had erased the landmarks he trusted. Sandbars that should have gleamed in the sun were drowned beneath. Chocolate currents and familiar rock faces looked foreign at this higher waterline. It was Elena who spotted salvation, a flat patch of land shaded by cottonwoods on river left. "That could work," she said, pointing. Marcus narrowed his eyes through the glare. The site looked promising, but reaching it meant cutting across the river's heaviest current, a maneuver simple in theory, yet dangerous in these swollen conditions. "All right, everyone. Hard paddle left on my call," Marcus shouted, his tone steady but edged with urgency. The crew readied themselves. Ferrying across had been routine in calmer waters, but this time the Arkansas was a predator lying in wait. As they pulled into the current, disaster struck. A hidden boulder, masked by the floodwaters, slammed into the raft's bow with bone-jarring force. The jolt hurled Jessica into the air before anyone could react. She hit the 47-degree water like a stone, the icy shock stealing her breath and igniting every nerve in agony. Training took over. She forced herself onto her back, feet forward, angling desperately for shore. "Throw rope!" Marcus roared. The raft spun, fighting waves that seemed to grow taller with every second. Sarah leaned dangerously over the side, screaming Jessica's name, while David abandoned his beloved camera and scrambled to help. Bobby's throwbag arced perfectly through the air, but Jessica was already beyond its reach, swept downstream in a torrent that seemed intent on erasing her. Panic prickled at the edges of order as the raft slammed between standing waves, each one a reminder that the river held all the power. Landmarks they had memorized on maps and during scouting runs were gone, transformed into an alien, hostile landscape. Then Amy screamed, pointing downstream. Against the chaos, a flash of red bobbed into view. Jessica's helmet. She was alive, clinging desperately to a half-submerged log, her grip fueled by sheer willpower. The log that had briefly saved Jessica was angled just right, creating a small eddy that stalled her rush downstream, a fragile moment of hope in the chaos. Marcus made a fateful decision in that instant, one that would haunt him for the rest of his days. Instead of following protocol and moving downstream to attempt the safer rescue from below, he gambled on a daring upstream approach. "River right! Hard!" he shouted, voice cracking over the roar. The crew dug in, muscles straining, and the raft inched toward Jessica's desperate grip. For a heartbeat, it looked like their gamble might succeed, until the river revealed its hidden trap. Beneath the flood-swollen surface lay a strainer, the skeletal remains of a fallen tree, its branches outstretched like the fingers of a drowned giant. Concealed by the high water, it waited silently, and by the time Marcus spotted the threat, there was no escape. The raft slammed into the branches with a bone-rattling impact. One of the air chambers deflated in an instant, and in the next breath, everyone was pitched into the freezing chaos. Sarah plunged beneath the surface, her world exploding into cold darkness as the river tumbled her like a discarded doll. When she finally clawed her way back into the air, sputtering and disoriented, a nightmare greeted her. The sight of Jessica's red helmet bobbing past, empty. The log she had clung to vanished into the torrent. She screamed her friend's name, but the river answered with silence. One by one, battered and shivering, the survivors clawed their way to the right bank. Elena emerged clutching a dry bag, its precious contents their only lifeline. Bobby staggered ashore with the throw, rope wrapped in his arms like a sacred relic. The twins collapsed together, clinging to one another in mute terror, while David dragged himself out of the current empty-handed, his camera lost forever, but his knife and whistle still strapped to his belt. Marcus stood waist-deep in the current, hair plastered to his face, eyes darting wildly over the foaming river. They had been swept nearly half a mile downstream, the canyon walls rearing up around them in steep, unforgiving stone. Sarah's cries echoed off the granite, fractured and mocking. "Jessica! Jessica!" The name bounced back at them like a ghostly refrain. Marcus forced himself to think, even as guilt gnawed at him. This was no longer an adventure. This was survival. Temperatures would plummet as soon as the sun dropped behind the rim, and they were stranded with almost no gear in one of the most isolated stretches of Browns Canyon. "Listen up," Marcus barked, summoning his training to keep panic at bay. "We need to get warm and dry before we can even think about finding Jessica. Bobby, do you still have the bivvy?" The engineering student nodded numbly, pulling a compact survival shelter from his soaked bag. Even as he handed it over, his mind worked through probabilities, distances, temperatures, odds of rescue. But the calculations offered little hope, and he kept his grim conclusions to himself. Elena unzipped the salvaged dry bag, her hands trembling as she pulled out food, a first aid kit, and a battered emergency radio. She fiddled with the dials, her voice thin as static filled the air. "It's no good. The canyon walls are blocking. The signal. No one can hear us." Silence fell heavy. The realization hit them like another wave. They were utterly alone. Amy and Andrea, moving with the quiet synchronicity of twins, found a rocky hollow that offered meager shelter from the wind. They gathered driftwood with mechanical precision, while David shaved tinder from a scrap of pine, sparks of focus piercing through shock. Sarah, her throat raw, still called Jessica's name into the void, each shout swallowed by the canyon. The sun slid lower, shadows deepening. Marcus looked upriver, then down, his jaw tight as he whispered to no one. 15 miles, maybe more, to the nearest road. He didn't add the truth clawing at him, that between here and civilization stretched some of the harshest, most unforgiving terrain in all of Colorado. Even if they had chosen to abandon Jessica and attempt an immediate hike for safety, Marcus knew it would take at least 2 grueling days to reach the nearest road. 2 days of navigating a labyrinth of ridges, canyons, and dense wilderness, where a single wrong turn could mean disaster. But Sarah's answer was instant and fierce. "We can't just leave her. What if she's hurt? What if she's right around the bend waiting for us?" Her words struck everyone like a lifeline. Yet Marcus felt the cruel weight of truth. He had seen what icy rivers did to human bodies. At 47 degrees, survival time was short. And even if Jessica had crawled onto the banks, she would be battling the same bitter cold and hunger they now faced, alone, possibly broken, and without fire or shelter. Still, hope was all Sarah had, and no one had the heart to shatter it. Night descended like a curtain, cloaking Browns Canyon in silence broken only by the endless rush of water. Around the fragile glow of their small fire, the survivors huddled close, their breath curling into the darkness. Elena, her voice steady despite trembling hands, rationed out energy bars and tried to keep spirits alive with talk of rescue. Bobby reassured them with logic. Their families expected them back by Sunday night, and when they didn't appear, search crews would mobilize by Monday. But David, his tone low and heavy, cut through the fragile hope. "That's 2 days away. A lot can happen in 2 days." Sarah refused the comfort of sleep. She sat vigil by the riverbank, calling Jessica's name into the void, each unanswered echo slicing deeper into her heart. The twins took shifts with her, their bond granting them strength to endure, though the shadows in their eyes betrayed their own unraveling. Marcus lay in the emergency bivvy, staring at the blaze of Colorado stars overhead, stars that mocked him with their cold permanence. He replayed the day again and again, the snap decision to ferry upstream, the hidden strainer, the sudden chaos, and each time the crushing weight of responsibility pressed harder on his chest. He had led so many trips without incident, but in one violent sweep of current and fate, his confidence had been shattered. By dawn, the fire was little more than embers, and daylight only sharpened the scale of their nightmare. Canyon walls rose sheer and unforgiving for hundreds of feet, cutting off escape. Landmarks that should have guided them were nowhere to be seen, drowned beneath swollen waters. They were utterly lost in one of Colorado's most remote wildernesses, with no signal, no raft, and dwindling supplies. Elena's inventory confirmed their grim reality. Enough food for 2 days if rationed, but water already a dire problem. The river churned with mud and sediment, too filthy to drink safely, and their first aid kit's purification tablets wouldn't last long. Hunger gnawed, but thirst loomed darker. Still, Sarah's resolve had not broken. After choking down a bite of stale energy bar, she rose with fire in her eyes. "I'm going downstream to look for Jessica. She could be out there, waiting for us." Marcus's instinct was to forbid her, but he understood. Inaction felt like betrayal. "If you go," he said firmly, "you're not going alone. You stay to the shore, no risks. 2 hours, then you come back." David volunteered, strapping on his knife and whistle, ready to follow Sarah into the unknown. The twins would gather wood, while Marcus and Bobby would reinforce the shelter. For hours, Sarah and David followed the canyon downstream, each bend promising answers, but revealing only more towering cliffs and churning water. The landscape was beautiful and merciless, the wilderness offering no sign of kindness. There were ledges where someone could have scrambled ashore, but no tracks, no scraps of clothing, no footprints in the sand. Jessica's presence was erased as though the river had swallowed her whole. Sarah's voice cracked as the miles wore on, her hope thinning with every step. David tried to encourage her, suggesting maybe Jessica had found higher ground or shelter, but his words hung hollow in the canyon air. When they finally turned back, the afternoon light was fading, their faces already carrying the grief of failure. Back at camp, the others read their expressions before a word was spoken. There had been no miracle, no sign of their missing friend. Marcus, who had spent the day scouting for escape routes, had little comfort to offer. The paths he found all required technical climbing skills none of them possessed. The truth pressed in from every direction. They were trapped, starving, thirsty, and one friend short in a canyon that seemed designed to keep them forever. They were trapped as surely as if marooned on an island of stone and rushing water. The canyon held them in a prison of towering walls, its beauty now a cruel disguise for their peril. "Tomorrow we have to decide," Marcus told the group, as they huddled close to their feeble fire, its flames fighting to stay alive against the cold. "We can wait here and hope someone finds us, or we can risk hiking out along the river. Both choices are dangerous." His words fell heavy, and for a moment, no one replied. Elena finally spoke, her voice breaking with exhaustion. "My parents expected me to call tonight. When I don't, they'll worry. They'll contact the university." Bobby added quietly, "My mom panics if I'm an hour late. They'll know something's wrong." The thought of parents sounding alarms brought a fragile thread of hope, but Marcus knew better. He had studied wilderness rescues, how even experienced search teams could take days, sometimes weeks, to find lost hikers in Colorado's vast backcountry. And with each passing day, Jessica's chances, if she had survived, slipped further away. Sarah sat in silence, her once bright eyes now hollow, fixed on the flames as though answers might rise from the embers. The laughter and fire that had defined her before the accident had vanished, leaving only grief and guilt gnawing at her from within. Marcus feared her breaking point was near. The twins, Amy and Andrea, had become the quiet caretakers of the group. They spoke little, moving with mechanical efficiency as they fed the fire and rationed supplies, their bond reduced to a language of glances and shared burdens. The second night was worse than the first. A spring storm swept through the canyon, dropping heavy, wet snow that soaked everything and turned their small camp into a frozen misery. Their fire hissed and sputtered, collapsing under the moisture, leaving them soaked and shaking by dawn. Elena's lips had gone pale blue, her body trembling with the signs of hypothermia, while Bobby's cough deepened into a rasp that no longer sounded harmless. On the third morning, catastrophe deepened. Before the others stirred, Sarah quietly gathered a few supplies, scribbled a short note, and slipped away downstream. By the time Marcus discovered her absence, she had hours' head start. David read the note aloud in a flat voice. She had gone to continue searching for Jessica, convinced her best friend was still alive. "She's going to get herself killed," David said. No inflection in his tone, just grim truth. Marcus's heart clenched. To split the group meant weakening their fragile survival chances even further. To stay put meant Sarah wandering deeper into the wilderness alone. He was cornered by choices where every path led to ruin. They spent the day shouting Sarah's name, scrambling over boulders, scanning every bend of the river. The effort only added to their toll. Elena collapsed into fever and weakness, her body losing the fight against the cold. Amy twisted her ankle on the rocks, her cries muffled by stubborn determination not to slow the others. Bobby's cough tore through his chest, sounding more like pneumonia than a simple chill. By evening, with no trace of Sarah and no improvement in Elena, Marcus made the decision that would weigh on him forever. "Tomorrow we hike out," he declared, voice raw with exhaustion and guilt. Andrea burst out, "We can't leave them!" Her sister's face echoed the same defiance. Marcus's voice trembled, not with weakness but with a leader's unbearable burden. "We're not abandoning them. We're going for help. Real help. Search teams, helicopters. If we stay here, we'll all die." The argument fractured the group, revealing how close despair had pushed them to the edge. The twins fought to hold on to hope. David, his optimism burned out, sided with Marcus, insisting escape was their only chance. Bobby nodded weakly, his illness silencing him from saying more, but his eyes told them he agreed. Elena, shivering under blankets, could only manage a faint murmur of support. By dawn of their fourth day, what remained of the group, 6 weary survivors, staggered away from their campsite. Elena leaned heavily between Amy and David, each step a trial. Bobby's cough was so violent he struggled to speak, yet he carried on. They left what food they could spare, carved messages into tree bark, and arranged stones in patterns visible from the riverbank, signs meant for Sarah should she somehow find her way back. Then they began their trek into the heart of one of Colorado's most unforgiving wildernesses. The land was merciless, jagged ridges, dense brush, and slick rock that rose like barriers against them. They had no map, no compass, and only Marcus's memory of the sun and his vague knowledge of the region to guide them. He walked at the front, jaw set, but inside he carried the dreadful truth. He wasn't sure they were going the right way. The canyon, which once promised adventure, had become a maze of stone and shadow. Each step forward was survival bought at the edge of despair. 11 days after the river had stolen their world, survival had been whittled down to raw willpower. Elena collapsed twice during the first day of their hike, her fever worsening until every step looked like it might be her last. Bobby stumbled beside her, his cough rattling through his chest with the weight of pneumonia, while David's feet blistered so badly that each step was torture. Amy limped heavily on her swollen ankle, and Andrea, usually her mirror of strength, finally broke. On the 5th day she sat on a fallen log and shook her head, tears cutting through the grime on her face. I can't keep walking when Sarah's back there somewhere." Amy knelt beside her, torn between survival and loyalty. The twin bond that had carried them through childhood now became an anchor of grief. It was David who steadied them, his voice quiet but firm. "Sarah would want you to live. She'd want you to bring help." Those words pushed them forward, staggering mile by mile, leaving improvised trail markers carved into tree bark and stacked stones, a breadcrumb trail for rescuers who might follow. By the 7th day, their bodies were broken. Elena drifted, in and out of fevered delirium. Bobby collapsed every few hundred feet, and Marcus bore most of the supplies while the twins took turns supporting the sickest. Then came the sound they thought they would never hear. The steady thrum of helicopter blades echoing through the canyon like a heartbeat. Marcus tore off his orange rain jacket, whipping it through the air as the group screamed with the last of their strength. The helicopter banked, slowed, then hovered overhead. Relief hit them like a tidal wave, just as Elena slipped into unconsciousness, saved in the final breath of time. Within an hour, they were wrapped in blankets inside a Salida hospital, tubes and warm fluids pulling them back from the edge. Elena was rushed into intensive care, Bobby treated for pneumonia that had nearly killed him, while the rest endured IV drips and frostbite treatments. Marcus, hands raw and swollen, sat in a sterile room across from Detective Morrison of the Colorado State Patrol, spilling out the story in jagged fragments: the swollen river, the hidden strainer, Jessica's sudden disappearance, Sarah's desperate flight into the canyon, the collapse of hope. His final plea was not for himself, but for the missing. We need to find them. Sarah's out there, with no gear, no shelter. She's been alone for 4 days. Detective Morrison, a man seasoned by too many tragedies in the wilderness, nodded gravely. Search crews were already mobilizing. Teams from 3 counties, helicopters, Civil Air Patrol, swiftwater specialists. For 3 relentless weeks, they scoured the Arkansas River. They found the deflated raft snagged on rocks 5 miles below the strainer. They recovered Jessica's scattered gear along the banks. They found the survivors' campsite and the carved messages they had left for Sarah. But they never found Jessica Wong or Sarah Mitchell. As the official search wound down, the families refused to surrender. Jessica's parents, who had flown in from San Francisco, poured their savings into private search teams, even turning to psychics in desperation. Sarah's mother, a single parent who had worked 2 jobs to put her daughter through college, refused to leave Salida. She camped in a small motel, joining every volunteer search she could, clinging to faith in the face of silence. Marcus returned to Denver, but normal life was impossible. His textbooks blurred into nothing. His classes felt like shadows. The guilt chewed at him endlessly. He was supposed to be the leader, the one who kept them safe. 2 of his friends had vanished under his command, a failure so heavy it crushed his sense of who he was. At the end of May, the university held a memorial service. There were no coffins, only flowers and photographs, and it felt less like closure than a communal cry for healing. Elena, still pale from her hospital stay, stood at the podium and spoke of Jessica's passion for nature, her dream of serving in the National Park Service. David, gaunt from losing 20 pounds in their ordeal, read aloud one of Sarah's poems published in the campus literary magazine, a piece about courage in the face of the unknown. His voice broke on the last line, and the silence that followed was the sound of a community grieving the living as though they were already gone. In the years that followed, the survivors' paths diverged, each shaped in quiet but profound ways by the nightmare that had bound them. Amy and Andrea could no longer bear the weight of familiar hallways, echoing with questions about their missing friends, so they transferred to different schools, clinging to their twin bond even as they tried to outrun memory. Bobby buried himself in engineering with almost punishing intensity, designing survival shelters as if his blueprints might rewrite the past. Elena, forever changed by the helplessness she had felt, shifted her studies to emergency medicine, vowing that she would never again stand powerless when lives were at stake. Official reports chalked up the accident to swollen spring runoff and hidden hazards that no map could warn against. No charges were filed, but new protocols emerged: better coordination with the National Weather Service, stricter safety standards for university programs, and a somber acknowledgement that the Arkansas could turn merciless in an instant. Time marched on, but the canyon never released its grip. Marcus, weighed down by guilt, turned his torment into purpose and became a search and rescue coordinator in Montana, dedicating his life to saving others from the wilderness. Elena rose through medical school, eventually becoming an emergency physician in trauma wards across the Southwest. David's blistered feet healed, but the fire in him did not. He became an investigative journalist, chasing uncomfortable truths wherever they hid. The Sullivan twins drifted apart and back together, their bond stronger than the scars. Bobby's designs reshaped how outdoor adventurers thought about survival, his engineering brilliance forever tethered to the week that had nearly killed them. Yet none of their accomplishments filled the void. Every year, as May 15th drew near, the survivors faced calls and letters from reporters, amateur sleuths, or grieving families clutching to theories. Some believed Jessica and Sarah had drowned, their bodies carried far downstream and lost to the Colorado River's vast veins. Others insisted the women had reached shore, but wandered deep into the backcountry, swallowed by exposure and silence. Theories spiraled outward, some dark, some desperate. Animal attacks, hidden survivalist kidnappers, even far-fetched tales of secret lives in South America. None brought peace. For the families, the absence of answers became its own torment. Jessica's parents aged under the weight of uncertainty, their San Francisco home transformed into a shrine of photographs and awards, each frame a reminder of the future that never came. Sarah's mother, rooted stubbornly in Salida, refused to leave the town that bordered the canyon. She waited, year after year, for the impossible moment when her daughter might step back into her arms. Detective Morrison, the man who had led the original search, carried the file on his desk until the day he retired in 2005. Whenever time allowed, he leafed through its pages again, hunting for a clue overlooked, a thread to tug. When he handed it over to a younger investigator, he wrote a single line on a yellow note. These girls deserve to be found. The river, however, flowed on, unburdened by memory. Each spring, Brown's Canyon filled with new rafts, new laughter, and the occasional reminder that water is both playground and predator. Outfitters told the story of the vanished students in hushed tones during safety briefings, turning tragedy into warning. The University of Denver hardened its outdoor program with mandatory training, emergency beacons, and check-ins, policies that came too late for Sarah and Jessica, but spared others. And as the 20th anniversary approached, the story once again rose from the depths, a chilling echo that refused to be forgotten. 2 decades after the tragedy, memory refused to die. In 2010, a documentary filmmaker approached the survivors about participating in a film that would revisit the incident. Some true crime podcasts had already speculated endlessly about what might have happened in those lost hours after the raft capsized, but a documentary promised to gather their voices in one place. Marcus, now a hardened search and rescue veteran, with weathered skin and tired eyes, agreed. For him, retelling the story was agony, but perhaps it could shake loose some clue, some lead that had been missed. Elena hesitated. Years of therapy had helped her battle the survivor's guilt that never truly left. But she recognized the importance of remembrance. She sat for a limited interview, her words clipped yet powerful, a doctor speaking both as a healer and as a woman who had lived through hell. When Lost in Brown's Canyon premiered at the Denver International Film Festival, the theater filled with families, rescuers, and investigators. Applause came with tears, and though the film reignited interest, the leads it generated proved empty. By the spring of 2011, 21 years later, the case had cooled again, and most assumed the canyon's secrets were sealed forever. That was when Jake Sullivan entered the story. No relation to Amy and Andrea, Jake was 28 years old and already a legend among climbers who whispered about impossible walls. Raised in Colorado Springs, he had grown up with his hands on rock and the thin mountain air in his lungs. By 2011, he had scaled peaks across the globe, carving out a reputation as a man drawn not to the famous climbs, but to the dangerous ones. Routes so treacherous most climbers dismissed them as foolish. His newest obsession was a 1,200-foot granite face hidden deep within the Browns Canyon wilderness, a wall no one had ever summited. To reach it would take 3 days of bushwhacking through country untouched by human boots, and the climb itself would demand at least 4 more. It was exactly the sort of brutal, lonely challenge Jake craved, the thrill of being the first to touch stone that had waited in silence for millennia. He had spent over a year preparing, poring over satellite imagery, sketching routes on topographic maps, and planning his camps. On May 10, 2011, just 5 days shy of the anniversary of the rafting accident, Jake shouldered a heavy pack at a trailhead near Salida. Inside was everything: ropes, cams, quick draws, a hanging ledge to sleep suspended in the sky, and enough food and water for a week of hardship. The first miles carried him through lush forests and wildflower meadows, before giving way to granite spires that stabbed at the horizon. He moved with the fluid efficiency of a man utterly at home in wilderness, his stride quick, his eyes scanning every ridge and shadow. On his second day, he noticed something curious, something absent from his carefully studied maps. A narrow canyon veered off the main valley, cutting deep into the rock. He paused, frowning at the dark slit in the cliffs. His objective lay further ahead, yet something about that hidden passage tugged at him, as if the mountains themselves whispered for him to look closer. Jake had bushwhacked through plenty of forgotten canyons before, but nothing had ever struck him quite like this one. What had begun as a simple shortcut had turned into something far stranger, an untouched gorge that seemed carved not just by time, but by secrecy itself. As the canyon funneled him deeper, its walls pressed close, rising hundreds of feet overhead until daylight narrowed into a slit of pale sky. The air was damp, filled with the scent of moss and mineral. The soundscape reduced to water dripping and the muffled thrum of his own heartbeat. When he spotted the shadowed recess behind a fallen boulder, he thought at first it might be just another alcove carved by erosion. But as he drew closer, the truth snapped into focus. This was no accident of nature. A rough shelter had been built there, its crude walls of logs and stacked stone wedged into the overhang like a barricade against the world. The blackened circle of a long-dead fire still scarred the ground. Scraps of rotted fabric clung to branches and lay matted in the dirt, hinting at bedding or clothing. Jake froze, every sense sharpened. He wasn't looking at the relics of old miners or trappers. He knew that instantly. The workmanship was recent, rough but practical, meant for survival rather than comfort. Whoever had built this had done so to vanish, to endure, and above all, not to be found. He stepped closer, the silence heavy, his headlamp beam cutting across details that churned his stomach. Etched into the canyon wall were not petroglyphs, but scratches, marks gouged by desperate hands. Rows of tallies carved into the stone, grouped neatly in fives, stretched across the rock like a haunting calendar. Days, weeks, perhaps years. Jake swallowed hard. This wasn't just a campsite, it was a prison of time. Among the litter scattered in the dirt lay fragments of modern gear, a cracked plastic buckle, the corner of what looked like a weathered nylon strap, a shredded piece of fabric with stitching too fine to be homemade. Jake crouched low, brushing aside dirt and pine needles, his gloved hand trembling as he uncovered more fragments. Something about the way the shelter blended into the canyon, the crude tally marks, the modern scraps, it all screamed of people who had once fought to stay alive here. And, in the back of his mind, an old story surfaced, one he had read in news clippings and heard whispered in climbing gyms, the rafting group that had vanished in Browns Canyon 21 years ago. Jake's hands shook as he lifted the orange scrap of fabric from the dirt, the faded material unmistakably from a life jacket, the kind river guides issued on rafting trips. Nearby, the rusted remains of backpack buckles glinted dully in the shaft of sunlight cutting through the canyon. But it was the half-rotted driver's license that made his breath catch. The card was too worn to read, the lamination blistered and peeling, yet its very presence whispered of a life that had once struggled to survive here. Jake's pulse quickened. This wasn't an old miner's hideout. Someone had been here. Someone lost. Someone desperate. And they had stayed long enough to count time in scratches carved into stone. As he looked closer, Jake realized this was not the work of one person. The shelters, though crude, bore different signatures. One sturdier, carefully built, the other hurried, almost panicked. Two survivors, he thought. Two lives intertwined in secrecy. Moving slowly now, treating each detail with reverence, he shifted rocks behind the secondary shelter and uncovered something out of place, a bright red waterproof container. His heart hammered as he pried it free. These canisters were the kind rafters used to protect documents, the kind meant to survive rapids and storms. When he twisted the lid open, the air seemed to leave the canyon. Inside was a time capsule untouched by 21 years of wind and snow. A Colorado driver's license for Sarah Elizabeth Mitchell, class of 1989. Her smiling face frozen in youth, expiration stamped 1994. Jake stared at the photo, unsettled by the familiarity of her expression, though he knew he had never met her. Beneath it were folded sheets of paper, pages filled with handwriting still sharp and strong. A journal, a voice reaching across 2 decades. The first entry was dated May 18, 1990, 3 days after the rafting tragedy that every Coloradan had grown up hearing about. Jake remembered being 7, overhearing adults whisper about the university students who vanished in Browns Canyon. Now, with Sarah's words in his hands, he realized the official account had been incomplete. She hadn't vanished without a trace. She had found Jessica. The entry detailed how Sarah, searching alone downstream, had heard faint cries and discovered Jessica alive, battered but breathing. Jessica had dragged herself to shore nearly 3 miles from the strainer. But she was broken, her leg shattered, her head injured, leaving her too weak to move. Sarah's writing described the moment with raw clarity. The tears, the relief, the terror that followed as reality sank in. Jessica couldn't hike out. Sarah couldn't bring herself to abandon her. In the end, they had chosen the only option that felt possible. Survive together, hidden in the canyon, waiting for a rescue that never came. Jake's breath caught as the story unfolded through Sarah's fading script, her words dragging him across 21 years of silence into the raw immediacy of their ordeal. At first, the entries brimmed with determination. Sarah and Jessica, two young women stranded in the wild, pooling their strength to carve a fragile existence out of nothing. They scavenged wreckage, built shelter from river debris, trapped rainwater in hollowed stones, and nursed flickering signal fires that never brought rescue. Sarah's descriptions were almost methodical, noting splints fashioned for Jessica's broken leg, edible plants carefully tested, and daily rituals to keep despair at bay. In those early months, hope breathed between the lines, confidence that the helicopters overhead would one day spot their fire, that families would come, that they would walk out of the canyon together. But as autumn closed in, the entries darkened, the search flights faded from the skies, and the optimism of summer decayed into fear. Sarah's once neat handwriting wavered, cramped by exhaustion and hunger. October's entries spoke of dwindling food, and Jessica's body weakening under infection and cold. By November, every line dripped with desperation. Jessica herself added a final trembling note on Thanksgiving Day, a farewell written with the last strength of a failing hand. "Sarah is the bravest person I know. Tell our families we love them." The words, brief yet devastating, struck Jake harder than any cliff face ever had. Then came Sarah's final testimony. December 1st, 1990. "Jessica died this morning. I buried her as best I could behind the big rock. I'm going to try for the road before the storm. If I don't make it, at least people will know we didn't give up. We survived 7 months when no one thought we'd last 7 days." Jake lowered the pages, his hands trembling, the canyon pressing in with unbearable silence. All around him, the evidence matched. The tally marks, the fire ring, the scattered remnants. It was all the work of 2 women fighting tooth and nail against nature itself. Slowly, Jake began searching beyond the shelter, the weight of Sarah's words spurring him forward. Behind the great boulder forming the shelter's rear wall, he saw the careful order of stones stacked not by chance, but by loving, deliberate hands. His chest tightened. The grave, Jessica's resting place, hidden beneath layers of rock that had guarded her for over 2 decades. He stood there in the canyon's silence, staring at the modest cairn, overwhelmed by both reverence and sorrow. Yet one question loomed larger than all the rest. If Sarah left in December, where had she gone? Did she collapse in the wilderness, lost before reaching help? Or had her trail simply been missed, her fate swallowed by the mountains? The cairn marking Jessica's grave was not the desperate pile of rocks Jake had expected. It was deliberate, careful, even reverent. Sarah had clearly poured her dwindling strength into giving her best friend a proper resting place, an act of love that echoed louder than any words. Near the shelter entrance, Jake uncovered even more startling evidence of Sarah's determination. Carved into a flat slab of stone was a crude but astonishingly accurate map of the canyon and its relationship to nearby ridgelines and landmarks. Along its edge were notations, simple arrows and scrawled marks, that seemed to chart the route she intended to follow in her final bid for survival. More chilling still, Jake found multiple waterproof containers hidden in crevices, each holding duplicate pages of Sarah's journal and a second copy of the map. She had thought beyond herself. Even as hunger and cold closed in, Sarah had ensured their story would not vanish with them. She had fought to leave a record, a voice in stone and paper that could outlast her body. By late afternoon, shadows spilled across the canyon like ink, and Jake felt the enormity of his find pressing down on him. His climbing objective, the towering granite face that had drawn him here, now felt insignificant, trivial against the weight of history in his hands. He pulled out his satellite communicator, thumb shaking as he typed the message that would change lives. Found evidence related to 1990 missing persons case. Need immediate law enforcement and SAR response. Coordinates to follow. Within hours, the quiet gorge that had held its secrets for 21 years thundered with rotor blades. Colorado State Patrol investigators, Forensic experts and search and rescue teams rappelled into the canyon, their floodlights and evidence kits replacing Jake's solitude with a hive of urgent activity. The revelations came quickly. DNA testing confirmed the remains at the cairn belonged to Jessica Wong. Sarah's journals, maps, and driver's license proved beyond doubt that both women had survived for nearly 7 months after the rafting accident, an almost unimaginable feat of endurance. Families who had lived 2 decades with unanswered questions now had something tangible. Closure, but also fresh grief. Jessica's parents finally laid her to rest, yet the knowledge of her prolonged suffering gnawed at them. And Sarah, whose words had carried across decades, remained missing. Teams followed the route sketched on her stone map, deploying satellite imagery and ground-penetrating radar to scour slopes and ravines where her body might lie, hidden by snow, storms, and time. The world reacted with shock. News outlets from Colorado to Europe carried the story of the canyon that had swallowed 2 women, only to release their voices 2 decades later. Debates flared about how the original 1990 search could have failed so completely. Marcus Thompson, now seasoned in search and rescue himself, read Sarah's words with a mixture of agony and vindication. Her journal proved that his leadership had bought time, that their training had mattered, but it also underscored the heartbreaking truth. With more exhaustive searching, both women might have been saved. They were stronger than any of us imagined, Marcus told reporters, voice breaking. The fact that we didn't find them says more about the limits of our search than about their will to survive. Dr. Elena Rodriguez saw something else in Sarah's writing. As an emergency physician, she recognized the precision in Sarah's makeshift medical care, splinting a compound fracture, monitoring for head trauma, improvising treatments with almost nothing. What she did went far beyond first aid, Elena told interviewers. She kept Jessica alive for months with injuries that should have killed her in days. That level of grit and care is extraordinary. The ripples of Jake's discovery spread far beyond Brown's Canyon, reshaping not just the lives of those once bound by tragedy, but also the way Colorado thought about wilderness itself. Amy and Andrea Sullivan, now established voices in environmental conservation, found new depth in their work. For them, Sarah and Jessica's fight to endure in the wild became more than memory. It was validation. Every acre of land they fought to preserve, every habitat they worked to restore, was carried on the shoulders of friends who had given their last breath to survive in those same landscapes. David Chen, once the eager student with a camera, now a seasoned investigative journalist, sat down at his desk to write the story of Jake's discovery for the very paper where his career had begun. His words cut through the noise. Sarah's journal is one of the most remarkable survival records ever uncovered. It transforms tragedy into a testament of courage and devotion, proving that friendship can outlast even death. Bobby Kim, who had spent his career engineering better emergency systems, was captivated by the technical ingenuity of the shelter Sarah and Jessica had built. He dissected the details with reverence, pointing out how their rainwater collection system, food storage methods, and use of salvaged materials showed not desperation alone, but true problem-solving. They engineered survival, he told one reporter. Not many people could have done what they did. At the same time, renewed investigation of the original 1990 search exposed a bitter truth. The canyon that had sheltered the women lay only 12 miles from the nearest road, a distance ground teams had believed they'd already covered. But the terrain's cruel deception, a maze of blind ravines and hidden clefts, meant rescuers had walked within shouting distance without ever knowing. Modern tools like thermal imaging and GPS tracking would likely have found them in days. In 1990, those tools simply didn't exist. Throughout the summer and fall of 2011, new search teams combed Sarah's mapped route, their efforts bolstered by technology unavailable 2 decades earlier. For months, they scoured creek beds, avalanche chutes, and thickets of pine and aspen. They found tantalizing fragments. A torn strip of orange nylon snagged near a creek crossing 3 miles from the shelter, matching the fabric of Sarah's salvaged gear. A line of faint boot prints in a shaded alcove, preserved by chance in soil never touched by sun. But Sarah herself remained lost. Whether she succumbed to the winter's fury or vanished under rock slides and snow, her final chapter stayed sealed by the wilderness. The case became a touchstone for cold case investigators and the true crime world alike. Television specials dramatized the ordeal, Podcasts devoted hours to dissecting Sarah's words, and armchair detectives pored over maps of Browns Canyon, imagining her final steps. The story had everything: friendship, survival, devotion, mystery, and the haunting possibility that, against all odds, Sarah might have made it further than anyone believed. Jake Sullivan, meanwhile, found himself unwillingly famous, his name bound to the canyon forever. He did finish his climb of the 1,200-foot granite wall, his rope tracing a line across untouched stone, but the victory felt hollow. "Finding that journal changed me," he admitted in Climbing Magazine. Sarah and Jessica weren't chasing adventure. They were clinging to life with everything they had. It forces us to ask why we seek danger voluntarily, when others never had the choice. On a practical level, their story reshaped Colorado's approach to search and rescue. State protocols were rewritten to mandate deeper sweeps of canyon systems, with drones, thermal cameras, and mapping technology augmenting ground crews. Searchers were trained to identify subtle signs of human presence: tally marks, improvised cairns, hidden shelters that might otherwise vanish into the wilderness. Sarah's journal and maps were preserved at the Colorado State Archives, not just as evidence of tragedy but as artifacts of resilience. Filed beside mining logs, expedition records, and historical letters, they became part of the state's wilderness legacy, a voice from 1990 that still whispered, "We survived together when no one thought we could." Before Sarah's original journals were sealed in climate-controlled storage, every page was digitized and photographed, ensuring her words, once hidden in a canyon no one could find, would live on for the world to read. Her account was more than a survival record. It was a testament to devotion, courage, and impossible endurance. In her entries, readers found the intimate texture of life on the edge, how she and Jessica scavenged and built, how she splinted, broken bones with scraps of wood, how she chose loyalty over self-preservation until the very end. For researchers, it was invaluable. For families, unbearably personal. The investigation into Sarah's final fate lingered for years after, occasionally reignited by a hiker's discovery of a torn strap or faded fabric in the wilderness, but no proof ever surfaced. By the 25th anniversary of the rafting accident, the 5 surviving members of the group gathered in Denver for a memorial service unlike any before. For the first time, they had answers. Not all, but enough to reshape their grief. Marcus Thompson, now gray and lined from decades of mountain rescue work, stood before the crowd and admitted the burden he had carried. "I've spent my life saving others because I couldn't save Sarah and Jessica. But now we know. They saved themselves, for as long as humanly possible. That changes everything." Elena, seasoned now as a physician, spoke with quiet conviction. "Sarah's care for Jessica reminded me why I became a doctor. Sometimes medicine isn't tools or training. Sometimes it's simply refusing to give up on someone." The Sullivan twins, Amy and Andrea, were shaken most deeply. For 25 years they had tormented themselves with unanswered questions. Did their friends suffer? Did they fight? Did they think of those they'd left behind? Sarah's words answered all of it, revealing a bond of friendship so fierce it endured starvation, cold, and despair. David Chen, no longer just a journalist but a witness, spoke not as a reporter, but as a man transformed. "Sarah and Jessica showed us what friendship really means. They never surrendered. That's their legacy." Bobby Kim, who had turned tragedy into engineering innovations, announced a scholarship fund for wilderness safety education, vowing to prevent others from facing the same fate. At the service, passages from Sarah's journal were read aloud. The final, chosen by her mother, struck every heart. "Jessica asked me why I didn't hike out alone when I found her. I told her because survival without her would have been survival for the wrong reasons. We'd make it out together, or not at all. Either way, we would never give up on each other." As petals were scattered into the South Platte River, its waters eventually merging with the Arkansas where their ordeal began, families felt a fragile sense of communion, a symbolic return to the current that had carried their daughters away. Yet the case of Sarah Mitchell remained open, her final journey still cloaked in wilderness silence. From time to time, search teams returned with new tools: drones, imaging technology, dogs, but the mountains held her secret. For Jake Sullivan, The climber whose curiosity had unearthed the hidden truth, the canyon never left him. He continued to scale impossible walls, but always with Sarah and Jessica's story in his heart. He became a voice for search and rescue funding, for wilderness safety, for honoring those who fight not for glory, but for life itself. And so their story endured, not only as a Colorado mystery, but as a reminder of what it means to cling to each other when the world insists you should let go. Jake often admitted, almost with disbelief, that his discovery had been pure chance. If I'd stayed on my planned route, Sarah's journal might still be there, hidden forever under stone and silence, he reflected in interviews. That randomness haunted him, but it also illuminated a larger truth, that the wilderness is full of stories buried beyond reach, waiting for the right set of footsteps to uncover them. Sarah Mitchell and Jessica Wong's ordeal transcended speculation and rumor. It had become Colorado folklore grounded not in myth but in fact, a testament written in their own words. Sarah's journal gave survival experts case studies in ingenuity. The meticulous notes on rainwater collection, shelter construction, food rationing, and even improvised medical care offered practical lessons for anyone who might one day face the same merciless odds. But beyond technique, it was the record of two young women who chose loyalty over despair, whose courage turned tragedy into a narrative of unbreakable human spirit. Rescue agencies across the western United States reshaped their protocols in the aftermath. No longer would canyon systems be dismissed as unlikely hiding places. Search leaders began to assume not just that survivors might last a few days, but that they could endure for months if determination and ingenuity were on their side. Each anniversary brought fresh retellings, through documentaries, podcasts, books, and each time the story reminded new generations that friendship can be as sustaining as food or fire. For the 5 survivors who had lived with guilt for 21 years, Jake's discovery had been a form of release. They finally understood that Sarah and Jessica had survived not because of what the group failed to do, but because of what those 2 women refused to stop doing: fighting, adapting, believing. Browns Canyon itself became something of a pilgrimage site. Though the shelter was protected by the Park Service, hikers who reached it spoke of an uncanny sense of presence, as though the air still held the determination of the women who had built it stone by stone. By 2020, 30 years after the accident, Sarah Mitchell's fate remained one of Colorado's most enduring mysteries. Technology, drones, ground-penetrating radar, satellite imaging, periodically scoured the wilderness where her final route was believed to lie. But the mountains had kept her secret. What endured instead was her voice. The journal, later published with proceeds funding search and rescue and wilderness safety education, became required reading in outdoor programs across the country. Students studied her entries for lessons in survival, but more often they returned to her words about Jessica, about refusing to abandon a friend, about endurance rooted not in skill but in devotion. In the end, Sarah and Jessica's story was not simply about loss. It was about the human will to endure, the power of love to defy despair, and the haunting truth that sometimes the greatest journeys are not measured in miles conquered, but in days survived together when no one believed survival was possible. Perhaps the most remarkable truth hidden in Sarah and Jessica's story was not about survival techniques or endurance, but about the unshakable power of human connection. For nearly 7 months, through starvation, cold, and despair, they held on not only for themselves, but for each other. Their friendship became the ultimate survival tool, stronger than equipment, stronger than training, stronger even than fear. The 5 survivors, now middle-aged and deeply marked by the passage of time, never forgot that lesson. Each year, on the anniversary of Jake Sullivan's discovery, they came together with Sarah and Jessica's families to honor the women whose courage reshaped their lives. Marcus Thompson, reflecting on a lifetime spent rescuing strangers in the wilderness, admitted that Sarah's journal had taught him more than any manual or course. "We can't save everyone, but every person deserves our full effort. Sarah and Jessica deserve that, and so does anyone who gets lost out there." Their legacy stretched far beyond Colorado. Social media kept their story alive, sparking waves of renewed interest as new generations discovered the journal and shared its words of devotion and perseverance. But the most fitting tribute lay in the practical changes their ordeal inspired. Across the West, search and rescue teams revised their training, retooled their equipment, and refined their protocols, always with the recognition that hidden canyons and unseen survivors could not be overlooked. Every climber rescued by thermal imaging, every hiker saved by updated emergency procedures, carried a thread back to Sarah and Jessica. Their legacy was not only the story of two women who refused to give up, but a gift to those who would come after them. Generations of adventurers and rescuers walk safer trails today because of what Sarah wrote, because of how Jessica endured, because of how both chose loyalty over surrender. And so, their voices echo still, carved into stone and preserved in words, a reminder that the strength of the human spirit is found not in solitude, but in the bond we refuse to break with those who depend on us. Thank you for joining us on this extraordinary journey of survival, friendship, and discovery. If Sarah and Jessica's story moved you, we invite you to subscribe, share your thoughts in the comments, and reflect with us on what it means to fight not just for yourself, but for those you love. Their courage is not just history. It is a call to all of us, a reminder that even in the darkest places, the human heart can carry a light.